Hello, everyone. My name is Maureen White, and I am the interim president of Refugees International, an organization that works tirelessly every day to advance the rights and well-being of displaced people around the world. It is my honor to welcome you today to our 2022 Autumn Advocacy Awards, broadcasting virtually from our offices in Washington, D.C., to celebrate people doing amazing work amidst the crisis in Ukraine. We have an extraordinary program for you today, including the award of the 2022 Richard C. Holbrooke Award to Vostok SOS. In addition, we have a conversation on the state of displacement and humanitarian advocacy with PBS NewsHour's Judy Woodruff and incoming president of Refugees International, Jeremy Konyndyk. And we have some special messages from our staff and friends. We are so grateful to our generous support who made this event and our work every day possible. And now I'll turn things over to my colleague, Hardin Lang.
Thanks, Maureen. My name is Hardin Lang. I'm the Vice President for Programs and Policy here at Refugees International. Day in and day out, I have the privilege of working with a team of some of the brightest and most passionate thinkers on our issues today. We all come together here at Refugees International with one goal: to advance the rights and well-being of displaced people everywhere. This work isn't easy. We see world leaders turning their backs on people seeking safety at our borders. We see officials pushing back to sea boats of mothers and children forced to flee their homes. And we see people who want nothing more than a shot at raising their families used as pawns in a political game that no one should be playing. And meanwhile, the number of displaced people has skyrocketed to a new high of more than 100 million people globally. But this team keeps on advocating for and with displaced people from Ukraine to Venezuela to Chad and beyond, all for a better future for all of us. This year, I was able to travel to Afghanistan and move around the country to look at the humanitarian situation on the ground and what needs to be done to improve it. I spoke with women leaders who remain in Afghanistan at great personal risk. They continue to do extraordinary things under the most challenging circumstances to deliver aid to women and girls in need. Their courage was deeply inspiring, to say the least. Rather than dwell on the restrictions and challenges of life under the Taliban, these women talked about the art of the possible and what they could achieve with even minimal support from the outside. I also spoke with Afghan aid workers who stayed in their post as the world collapsed around them in August 2021. They did so because the communities they served depended on them. As the Taliban swept over the country, these officials had no idea what would come next for them or their families, but they felt the call to stay in their community and deliver. In that spirit, Refugees International will not cease. We need legislation now that creates permanent pathways to citizenship for Afghans who were evacuated to the United States. We also must ensure that humanitarian needs inside of Afghanistan are met, and quickly. And we need Afghans themselves, like the ones who I met this summer all over the country, to be at the very center of those solutions. Every cent that you donate today goes towards making this work possible. I want to thank everybody who has supported our work over the last decades and years. Like us, you have not given up on the idea of a better future for displaced people, and we are so very grateful for your commitment. Now, it is my distinct pleasure to turn the floor over to author, journalist, human rights advocate, and longtime friend of Refugees International, Kati Martin, for the presentation of the 2022 Richard C. Holbrooke Award. Kati, over to you.
Thank you, Hardin. Today's event is personal for me. Each year, Refugees International presents the Richard C. Holbrooke Prize to a member of civil society who has shown great courage and commitment in helping displaced people. The award is named in the memory of the late Ambassador Richard C. Holbrooke, who served as chair of RI until 1999. Richard was the son of refugees. Indeed, he married one. I myself came here as a child speaking no English and escaping Russian forces who had reoccupied my own homeland of Hungary, while Richard's parents had fled the Nazis several decades earlier. Richard always placed refugees at the core of his diplomacy, whether he was negotiating in the Balkans or in Afghanistan, or indeed as a very young diplomat in the 1970s in Cambodia, helping 1.5 million Cambodians fleeing Khmer Rouge atrocities. Richard helped to assure them sanctuary in the United States, where they eventually settled. We at RI have been and continue to be inspired by his example and by his leadership during the current tragic war in the Ukraine. That war has already cost 7 million people to be displaced from their homes and shows no sign of abating. I know that Richard would have been extraordinarily moved and inspired by this year's award winner of the Holbrooke Prize, Vostok SOS, Vostok SOS in Ukrainian. Since the Russian invasion began last February, Vostok SOS has led the effort to help tens of thousands of displaced people, Ukrainians, evacuate from their homes to sanctuary, as well as recording war crimes committed as they occur on the ground. When Refugees International first arrived to Ukraine, we were directed to Vostok SOS and told that they were the best source if we really wanted to know what was going on the ground. Their courage and their strength continue to inspire us. So it gives me great pleasure to welcome Yulia Krasilnykova, Executive Director of Vostok SOS, who joins us now from the front line in Ukraine. Yulia, congratulations to you and to your remarkable team, and please know that you are in our hearts.
Дякую, Кеті, за тепле представлення. Вітаю, мене звуть Юлія Краsilnykova, я є директоркою благодійного фонду Vostok SOS. І для мене велика честь прийняти щорічну нагороду Річарда Холбрука від Refugees International від імені всієї нашої команди. Я хочу подякувати Кеті і Refugees не тільки за цю нагороду, а й за нашу щоденну співпрацю у боротьбі за краще майбутнє для 100 мільйонів переміщених осіб в усьому світі, включно і з нами тут в Україні. Як і амбасадору Holbrooke, нам у Vostok SOS дуже добре відомо, що таке війна і що таке переміщення, яке може охопити регіони і нації. Vostok SOS виник у 2014 році внаслідок російського вторгнення до нашого дому. Тоді ми зосередили зусилля на допомозі людям у Луганській та Донецькій області, де з роками ми виросли до штату в понад 100 осіб та сотні волонтерів, які активно реагують на кризові ситуації по всій країні. Після російського вторгнення 24 лютого ми були одними з перших, хто надавав допомогу внутрішньо переміщеним особам. Координація евакуації, зокрема для людей з особливими потребами, надання першої гуманітарної та психологічної допомоги, а також розслідування та документування воєнних злочинів. Всі наші зусилля спрямовані на просування демократичних змін та цінностей прав людини в Україні. Потяг життя – так називається нинішній найдовший залізничний маршрут, який з'єднує Схід та Захід. Він курсує щодня, забираючи людей з Донецької області в безпеку. А для того наші евакуаційні екіпажі вивозять людей з зон обстрілів до останнього в регіоні діючого залізничного вокзалу. Один з вагонів спеціалізований, в ньому їдуть люди з інвалідністю. Саме таким випадкам ми приділяємо найбільше уваги та зусиль. Від початку повномасштабного вторгнення нам вдалося евакуювати з лінії фронту понад 30 тисяч осіб, з них близько 3 тисячі маломобільні. Як зазначила Кетті, премія Річарда Холбрука від Refugees International щорічно присуджується одній з локальних організацій, яка виконує виняткову роботу, допомагаючи переселенцям. І для нас велика честь отримати цю відзнаку. Український уряд та громадянське суспільство взяли на себе провідну роль у гуманітарному реагуванні та лишаються основними рушіями у процесах надання допомоги. Локальні організації досконало знають ситуацію на місцях і ефективно та швидко знаходять рішення. Кооперація міжнародних організацій з українськими спрощує координацію та покращує ефективність оцінки гуманітарних потреб і реалізації програм допомоги. Я хочу подякувати моїм колегам за невичерпну наснагу, витривалість та сміливість, з якими кожного дня команда повертається до своєї нелегкої роботи, щоб наблизити перемогу та підтримати тих, хто потерпає від війни. І я хочу ще раз подякувати вам, Кетті і Refugees, наші найкращі побажання сьогодні на вашому заході. І ми щиро сподіваємось продовжувати справу амбасадора Голбрука кожного наступного дня і року.
Thank you, Yulia, and to your whole team for the work you are doing to support your neighbors and friends at this moment of greatest need. Your work inspires all of us at Refugees International. My name is Rachel Schmidtke, and I'm a senior advocate for Latin America at Refugees International. I work on Venezuela, a crisis similar in scale to that of Ukraine. Much like Ukraine, just a few weeks ago, the number of Venezuelans forced to flee their homes reached a staggering 7 million. In April, I met with many people from Venezuela who were making their way towards the Darien Gap. The Gap is a 100-kilometer stretch of dense jungle that is one of the most dangerous land crossings in the hemisphere. The people I met had been traveling for weeks or months in harsh conditions. The trek ahead would be no easier. Mudslides, sweltering heat, difficult terrain, theft, and violence are common threats. But people there told me they had no other choice. Home wasn't any safer. They had to leave. Bearing witness to these journeys and the strength it takes to leave everything behind to undergo such a dangerous crossing with nothing but hope for a better future for your family will stay with me for years to come. It's my job at Refugees International to translate these stories into policy change so that people forced to flee their homes can find safety. Thanks to all of you who make this work possible. We could not do it without you.
Hi, my name is Yael Shacher, and I'm Director for Europe and the Americas at Refugees International. I'm also an historian of the U.S. asylum system. I know by knowing history that protection for people seeking asylum here in the United States is under threat. And it's my job at Refugees International to fight back and to make sure that the United States provides access to asylum and upholds the dignity of people who come here seeking refuge. My first assignment at Refugees International was to work on a plan to help end the Remain in Mexico program, a program put in place by the previous administration. The program made people wait in danger in Mexico while their asylum cases were pending. I dove right in. I attended court hearings for people in the program, met with people in Mexico who were experiencing violence and deprivation there, and even helped some people gain access to asylum here in the United States. I get so much joy from speaking to these people about how they're rebuilding their lives here. And this summer, after 3.5 years of advocacy, the Supreme Court ruled that the Remain in Mexico program could come to an end. We still have a very long way to go to make sure the United States allows people to access asylum at its southern border and receives people seeking safety with dignity. But if history teaches us anything, it's that we are at our best when we welcome the stranger. Refugees International sets out every day to make sure that we have a more welcoming world for people who are forced to flee their homes. Thank you all for being with us here today and for supporting our work. You help make it possible. And now back to you, Maureen.
Thanks so much, Yael. It is now a real honor to introduce a conversation we recorded a few days ago with PBS NewsHour anchor Judy Woodruff and Refugees International's incoming president, Jeremy Konyndyk.
Jeremy, it's great to be here to speak with you. Congratulations on your new role at
Thanks so
Refugees
much.
International.
Thanks so much. It's a real pleasure to talk to you about it.
So you've had quite a long career working in the humanitarian arena, working with displaced persons. You've been in some of the most challenging parts of the world during real crises. What originally drew you to this work? What keeps you going?
3 days after I graduated from college, I got on a plane and went to Albania to work on the Kosovo refugee crisis. And from that moment, I've really been hooked. And I think two things hooked me and two things have sustained me in this. One is the mission. It's such a compelling mission to do this work, to support and help the most vulnerable people on the planet, and to help them to to realize their potential. And I think that we as RI try to frame this as empowering those who are affected by crisis, not putting ourselves at the center of the story, putting them at the center of the story. And that's something that I've always found in my career, and something that has drawn me to RI. I think the other thing that really sustains me is the people and is the relationships that you make in this work. Some of the most interesting, most ethical, most compelling people you'll ever meet are doing this work or are in the communities that we're serving, and so it's the people and the relationships and the mission that I think have drawn me to this and sustain it.
You come here, of course, from USAID, overseeing a massive effort there with regard to COVID, the pandemic. Samantha Power called you, and I'm quoting, an instrumental force in U.S. efforts to vaccinate the world. I mean, this had to be, and we hope it's just a once-in-a-lifetime thing for all of us. But what would you say are the lessons you learned from that experience?
One of the really key lessons of the pandemic, and particularly of the work that we did on vaccinating the world, is the importance of starting with the voices of the people you're trying to help. A lot of what went wrong initially with global vaccine access was a failure to listen to and a failure to equip the people who are on the front lines. What we saw was rich countries understandably met their own vaccine needs first before they began sharing with others. And when South Africa began producing vaccines, they very rapidly began sharing with the rest of the continent. I think there's a key lesson there about building the capacities to help and building access to resources, building access to assistance closer to the populations that need it. And I think there's a very parallel issue at play in the humanitarian system. So much of the financing for the system and so much of the ownership of the system resides in big global institutions that are pretty distant from the people they're serving. And I think what we need to do is devolve a lot of that. The more we can devolve power, the more we can devolve voice, the more we can devolve resources closer to the populations we're trying to help, the more effective that will be. And I think we saw that, with vaccine production and financing, and we see that with humanitarian assistance.
The challenge you face with this organization seems to be overwhelming. We are, at a moment when we not only see conflict still raging in parts of the world. Climate change is something that we're now more aware of than ever. People are being displaced, as we say, not just by conflict, but now by how we see climate changing. How do you look at the need to get your priorities right in this? How do you decide what most to focus on when it comes to you've got to think about the whole world. How do you see that?
I think to start at a really macro level, these are big challenges. They're not necessarily unprecedented or unmanageable. And I think it's important as we talk about these challenges to say, yes, they are staggering, but they're not impossible to address. And there is a way to do this. There is a way to help people at scale if we have the political will to do so. And I think the importance of an organization like RI, as an organization that focuses on that policy level, is to point the way, to show the art of the possible on managing these challenges. It can feel paralyzing when all you see is crisis and you don't see a way to address it. And I think if we look at history, if you look at the post-World War II era, if you look at how the U.S. managed the arrival of Vietnamese boat people in the 70s, which was one of the things that created, kind of spawned Refugees International and a lot of other aid organizations, what we find are these instances of huge crises that frankly are as large as anything we're seeing today, but there was the political will to manage them. And I think what we've lost in recent years is some of that political will. And so I think as I look to the future for RI, we want to focus on those discrete crises, but I think the more macro issue is we also need globally to rebuild some of that political will to manage crises in a humane way.
One of the things that's becoming clearer as time goes by is that the displaced people themselves are not part of the decision making, that it's made at a very high level. These decisions, big decisions made at a high level, they're not part of the conversation.
That's right.
How do you, as the incoming boss at Refugees International, see, how that should change?
Yeah, that's been a problem in the humanitarian architecture for many years, that we have an amazing global system for providing assistance and providing and advancing protection, but it tends to be driven by a more a supply-centric mentality. So you have these big, incredibly capable but very big multilateral agencies that drive the discussion, drive the dialogue, and it can be hard for the voices of affected people to break through. And I think one of the real lessons is we need to do much more to put affected people at the center of how we make decisions. And so RI is trying to lead by example on that. We have always found, and frankly we've researched to back this up, that refugees and displaced people are the most compelling advocates for their own need. And we have a system that doesn't put them at the center of that right now. And so we need to work towards changing that system, and RI is going to lead by example in that, and is doing that in centering refugee voices in our own advocacy.
One of the things that RI has tried to be vocal about and raise the visibility of is the intersection between climate change and migration. We know this is something the Biden administration is looking at. How do you see opportunity to influence the thinking of official U.S. policy on this?
So I think a few things are important on climate migration. One is this is not a future problem, it's a now problem. And in fact, it's a problem that's been with us for a while. If you look back to crises like the Darfur crisis, the Syria crisis, the crises in the Horn, all of these have a climate component to them. The change in climate patterns, the change in food patterns drives and exacerbates crisis, and that in turn drives migration. We have had 3 historic level droughts in the Horn of Africa since 2011. We're in the midst of the worst of them right now. And we're going to continue to see that, and it's likely to accelerate. And so I think what policymakers need to do is think ahead to how we're going to manage these problems. Having a sort of ad hoc, reactive, disordered response to rising levels of climate migration is going to be bad from just a policy and a technical perspective, but also quite bad from a political perspective, because we've seen in the last 10 years a real tie between the rise of extremist politics and negative reactions to asylum and to flows of people seeking refuge. If we see those flows grow and we can't get better and more intentional about managing it, I think the political impacts of that are going to be quite dire as well. So I think there's a need to reframe both the policy, but also to reframe the politics to say this doesn't have to be a zero-sum thing. These are manageable problems. And ultimately, if we look back to history, if we look back to that post-World War II era, if we look back to the ways we handled migration from out of Vietnam in the wake of the Vietnam War, and even what's happening right now with Ukrainians in Europe, these are manageable situations if we choose to manage them. And that is also how you blunt some of the more extremist political reactions.
I'm sure it caught a lot of attention when you said in the announcement about your new role, and I'm quoting here, that politicians on all sides have treated people fleeing crisis as if they are the crisis, and treat it as a problem to be managed rather than human beings. Expand on that. I mean, what are you speaking about there, and how do you even begin to change that?
We have this tendency to always talk about every crisis as if it is big and unprecedented and something that we can't manage. I think there are many big crises, some of them are unprecedented, but we can actually manage a lot of them if we choose to. So talking about people seeking refuge as if it's a flood or if it's a deluge, that I think plays into some of the more negative political reactions, and it creates a context in which all politicians look at this as a problem and then are kind of scrapping over how humanely we will deal with the problem or who will manage that problem more effectively, as opposed to looking at this as it doesn't have to be a zero-sum issue. It is not a harm to the United States or to other countries when people seek refuge and are brought into the U.S. My former colleague Michael Clemens from the Center for Global Development has written extensively about it's actually a net value add economically when we take refugees into this country. They turn into net economic contributors within a few years. That mentality has not been infused into our politics, and I think what we tend to see is the left and right arguing over the finer points of how do we. They kind of accept the premise that this is a problem, and then argue over how humanely or how effectively do we manage it. I think we need to reframe that to say this is not a problem. It's a challenge. It's a challenge we can manage, and it's also an opportunity to strengthen and help the country. And a lot of throughout our history, I think there is a deep sense within the DNA of America that part of what we do and part of why we exist is to protect and support people seeking refuge, and that the strength of this country comes from that.
There's so many crises that you could, at any given moment, be worried about, thinking about. But right now, as you begin to take on this new position, what keeps you up at night?
Beyond any individual crisis, and there are plenty of problems in any of those individual crises, but I think the more macro issue that I worry about is I think we face this nexus of rising political extremism, often in reaction to people seeking asylum, and the fact that over the next 10 or 20 years, with climate change accelerating, we're likely to see more and more of that. And if we don't get out ahead of that, it could be obviously very bad for individuals. It could be very bad in terms of just the kind of the policy challenge. But more fundamentally, it could drive some really toxic politics. And whether that's the rise of political extremism in countries in Europe, some of the challenges we've seen in this country, I think there's a real kind of impulse by some of those more extreme voices to cast this as a disordered situation, an unmanageable situation, a crisis. And I think we need to be much more forceful in saying it doesn't have to be that. If we let it be that, if we accept that framing of the issue, then I think we are in for a very rough ride over the next 20 years, not just in terms of the human impact of the migration, but also the wider impact that could have on our politics.
I'm going to circle back to what we spoke about at the beginning. You've worked in government, you worked in think tanks, you've worked in the humanitarian arena. What, at this point in your career, what do you think drew you to want to be part of this advocacy organization, specifically RI?
I've gone back and forth between operational response and advocacy. I started my career in the field, working first in the Balkans and then later working in a number of countries in Africa. And what you find when you're working at that level is that some of the problems that you keep running into can't be solved at that level. They are policy problems, and you need to go up to a more macro level to try and resolve those. And so when I first came back to Washington from the field, it was driven by that recognition that the things that were frustrating me were not going to be solved by where I was working. They needed to be solved at an advocacy level and at a policy level. And I think what I found in government as well is, when you're in government, you have certain guardrails on what you can do. There is a sort of, there's an Overton window of how much you can affect policy or make kind of the decisions that you can make that is set by some of those political parameters, but it's hard to move those political parameters when you're on the inside. I think what the value and the power of an organization like RI is that we can try and shift that window. And we need a good inside-outside game working with our counterparts in the government where they have the ability to make the change we want to see, but also to shift the political landscape that they're operating within so that they too can move more in the direction that we want to see. And I think that's a hard thing to do when you're inside government.
Jeremy Konyndyk, taking over as the president of Refugees International RI. Congratulations.
Thank you so much.
It's great to have this conversation.
Likewise, it's a pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Judy and Jeremy. Jeremy, your vision on a way forward on advocacy for displaced people is inspiring. We are looking forward to your leadership in our next chapter. And now I want to extend an enormous thank you to everyone who made this event today possible, especially Mary and David Boyes, Marilyn Jimmy Tish, Eva and Glenn Dubin, Jeffrey Tyndall and Cheryl Ferguson, and David and Catherine Bradley. Thank you all so much.